Hi, we're back again to discuss the theology of the city. This time we want to look at the historical aspects of the theology of the city and what we can learn from history. Now, you have a good article to read this week. Actually, it's a book chapter out of a very good book, and it will answer a lot of the historical questions for you. I'm not going to talk about what they talk about. I want to kind of go in a little bit of a different track. Last time we looked at what the Bible had to say about the city. Now I want to go back into human history and look at the city from BC times up through to the contemporary period and look at how the city has changed or how it's been viewed. Back in ancient times, back during the times of the patriarchs or Moses or even David, the authors make this point really well. The city served three main functions. It served as a place for safety, it served as a place for socialization, and it also served as a place for worship. Many of the cities that of the ancient times functioned as city states. You would have the city that was owned by then the land around that city was either owned by the people of the city or the city itself, and these cities themselves became little states. And every city was somewhat independent until it was consolidated by a larger and more powerful king. We begin to see the growth of world empires in the 8th century BC, or 8th and 9th century BC, with the rise of Assyria and their capital city of Nineveh. Then we see the Babylonians with their capital city of Babylon, and the Persians with their multiple large cities, and then, of course, the Greeks with their numerous large cities like Alexandria. And then finally we get to Rome and its centrally located large city. Now that's in Western civilization, but in China and India and other civilizations all over, cities played very much the same role. They were centers of worship, they were centers of socialization and commerce, and they were centers of safety. Safety in numbers, combination of combining goods and services, as well as getting together to worship. And that's what we see cities as being. Now, let's harken back just for a moment to the discussion of the Bible and the city. We learned that Israel began as a very pastoral, rural culture, at least in the times of the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on. Then when they entered the Promised Land, they were still rural, but cities were useful for the previously discussed functions. Then once David comes along and establishes Jerusalem as the capital, and then Solomon solidifies it, we begin to see a movement among Israel from a rural pastoral culture to a more urban culture. Then once we get to the times of the captivity, then we begin to see Israel become more and more urban in increasing numbers. So much so that when the Babylonian captivity ends and the people return under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah and Ezra, Jerusalem is the center of life, and it's a very urban culture. Fast forward to the times of Jesus. You have most Jews living in cities. Granted, there are still Jews living in the countryside, there are still farmers, but the thrust of life has moved from the farm to the city. And that's not only true of what we see in the Bible and Israel, it's what we see as true among the Jews all over the populated world. There was a huge Jewish contingent in the large cities of the Roman Empire, like Alexandria and Rome and Antioch and Ephesus. Those cities were heavily populated with Jews because the Jews became very urban. Then when the gospel is spread in the book of Acts, when we see the New Testament open up and the expanse of the preaching of the good news of Jesus Christ, we see that done in the city more often than not. Paul's missionary journeys were to cities. Now, he preached among the people who lived in the countryside, but his main thrust was to go to the synagogue in the city where the Jews congregated and proclaim Jesus there first. And then if the Jews rejected the message, he would then take the message to the Gentiles of the city. We see Paul working in cities like Iconium and Lystra and Derbe and Ephesus and Corinth and Berea and Thessalonica and Philippi and Athens and Rome. Paul's Antioch, Pisidian Antioch, all over. We see Paul operating in cities. Now, once that apostolic generation dies off, and the next generation of Christians comes along, the apostolic fathers, we see the church congregated in cities. As the church moves from a Jewish reality to a Gentile reality in those decades between the 60s and 100 A.D., as the apostles die off and their successors take their places, we see Christianity become a very, very city-centered faith. Antioch became an early stronghold of Christianity. Jerusalem was until it was destroyed. Corinth became a stronghold of Christianity. Rome became a stronghold of Christianity. Alexandria soon did. And we see these big cities of the Roman Empire become the centers of Christian life and thought. You could scarcely find a voice from the first 3 to 5 centuries of Christianity that was not tied to a city. I'm just going to think of the ones that I can remember. We have Ignatius, who was the bishop of Antioch. We had Cyprian, who was the bishop of Carthage. Clement of Alexandria. Origen of Alexandria. Athanasius of Alexandria. John Chrysostom of Constantinople. Hippolytus of Rome. Augustine of Hippo. And the list goes on and on and on and on. They were city folk, and they dwelled in cities, and they preached in cities, and they set their work up in the city. So Christianity in its origins and in its early days was city oriented. Even think of the Great Commission, the one that Jesus proclaimed in Acts chapter 1. First to Jerusalem, then to Judea, then to Samaria, then to the ends of the earth. Look at the cities involved there. Jerusalem was a city. Judea was a province that was dominated by Jerusalem. Samaria was a province, but its ancient capital city was Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And then we see in that apostolic behavior pattern that the apostles lived in cities, preached in cities, congregated in cities, taught in cities, wrote from cities to people in cities. Continuous pattern of city evangelism, city teaching, city life. I think that pattern is unmistakable in the New Testament and the early church. As I said, nearly all of the important figures of early Christianity all were tied to an urban location. Again, those big cities: Rome, Constantinople, Ephesus, Alexandria, Antioch. Again and again and again, you keep hearing these cities being tied to important early Christian leaders. Then in the West, the fall of Rome in 476 triggered something very traumatic in Western civilization. The city was crushed. The great city of Rome, that is, was crushed as a center for worship and socialization / commerce and safety. And then that propelled the West into a dark age where there was very little commercialization, there was very little socialization. Safety was non-existent pretty much. So for about 400 to 500 years, the West was in the throes of this dark age where there was no city and there was no culture. There was no commerce. There was not much of anything. There was no safety. All there was the church. It was the only thing that stood. And even it stood based on its glory days of the past. In these years, there were not the great teachers that we saw in the third and fourth and fifth centuries of Christianity. They were not to be found. Learning died away. It was only preserved by the monks and the monasteries. And there was a great shift at this period of time where the center and the heartbeat of the faith went from the city to the countryside, specifically to the monasteries. But the people were the ordinary people, that is, were too unlearned and too unable to help themselves to be a whole lot of good. And this lasted up until the 10th century, and then slowly things began to get better. But even throughout the medieval period, we don't see cities being the centers of the Christian world as much as we did in the beginnings of the church. It's beginning to make a comeback, but we still have the idea of monks and monasteries, cathedrals, but we don't have the city, that vibrance of the city. Western Europe would become very largely what I would call a more rural faith for quite some time. Then we get to the Protestant Reformation. Now that happened in cities. You had Martin Luther in Wittenberg, and you had Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, and then John Calvin and his associates in Geneva. So we had a city Reformation, but it was still a divided city-country movement. The people were still not city dwellers the way they once were. The great cities that we saw in the Roman Empire, like Rome and Alexandria and such, didn't make a comeback for a long period of time in the West. You just didn't have them. And even though the Reformation itself was a city event, I would say that the urban flavor of Christianity was still lagging behind the rural. That occurred up until the Industrial Revolution. Now, early America even was before the Industrial Revolution, and early American Christianity was very rural because early America was very rural. The city of Philadelphia, I'm not sure that I'm right about this, but I think I remember reading at the time of the American Revolution had 40 or 50,000 people. Philadelphia now has 4 or 5 million people. But it was a very small, big city, and it was the biggest city in the country. It was a very rural world until that Industrial Revolution, until factories began producing goods and services to the marketable public, and people began to flock to these cities for work, leaving the farm and coming to the city. The Western world was still very rural, but the Industrial Revolution began to change all that. And up sprang great industrial cities. And we know this to be the case. They were either centers of industry or centers of commerce working through industry. New York, Boston, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Detroit, mostly in the Northeast. And then since then, as the population has spread westward and southward, we now have the huge cities of Chicago and Los Angeles and Houston and Dallas and San Antonio and Phoenix, Atlanta, to join the other older, more established cities. But rural life in America was the norm until after the Civil War, till really the 1880s, 1890s, first decade of the 20th century. And so I think that largely the Christian faith in America is very rural in its outlook. It's very rural in its heartbeat. But now we live in a time where most people live in the city. 80% of the United States can be classified as urban. That doesn't mean that 80% is deep into the city, but it's urban, where only 20% is rural. But I think it's fair to say that much more than 20% of the population has a rural mentality because they've migrated to the city. And so the history of cities was almost a roller coaster. In the pastoral times, cities weren't very important. They weren't great or they weren't mighty. But when world empires came along, the big cities skyrocketed. The Ninevehs and Babylons, the Suses, the Athens, and the Romes. But then when Rome fell and it plunged the West into a dark age, cities went down rapidly. And they were on a slow but very steady, slow climb from the beginning of the Middle Ages all the way up to the 1800s. And then the Industrial Revolution took over and they took off. Now that we live in a post-industrial society, cities are the centers of information, banking, and technology. And so they're still growing faster than ever. And we need to find challenges or we need to find ways to meet the challenge of the growing city. Well, that's a short history of the city. Next time we will take a look at the theology of the city and what an urban theology is, or at least try to lay our finger on what it means to have an urban theology and where those specifics lie. I hope this has been helpful for you. Have a great day.